Hey everyone, welcome to another deep dive. Today we're tackling a tough but really important topic: how policing misconduct and racial identity intersect here in the U.S.
Definitely
It's
complex.
layered, right?
Yeah.
But to help us unpack all of this, we're going to be looking at this super interesting academic article.
Okay.
It was published earlier this year. It's called Policing Misconduct as a Racial Identity Issue: Understanding the Intersection of Race and Law Enforcement. So by the end of this deep dive, hopefully we can all walk away with like a clear understanding of the historical context, and just some of the key statistics that the article brings up, and just really understand the factors that play into this complex issue.
Yeah, because it's one thing to just see the problems, but how do we move forward? And that's something we're going to explore as well. What can we actually do?
Totally. So before we get into like all the nitty-gritty details in the historical context, I think it's important to define what exactly we're talking about when we say policing misconduct, right?
Yeah, that's important.
Is it just breaking the law, or is there something more to it?
I think it goes beyond that. Policing misconduct, it actually covers a ton of different actions by law enforcement officers. And these actions, they're harmful, they're unethical.
Gotcha.
We're talking things like excessive force, racial profiling, abuse of authority. So, yeah, it's breaking the rules for sure, but it also has this huge impact on the public's trust in law enforcement.
Yeah.
And that's especially true in communities that have been marginalized historically.
Exactly. And you touched on trust, and the article really emphasizes how these actions affect communities, especially communities of color, right? It's not just some theoretical legal thing. It's real people's lives, how they feel like safe or targeted.
Exactly, their lived experiences. And to really get this issue, I think we need to understand the history, like how did we get here? U.S. policing has always been tied to race, and that's key.
Okay, so let's rewind way back. Where does this story begin? Early policing in America. What was that like?
Okay, so picture early 1800s, U.S. cities are starting to form, and with them, you see formal police forces popping up.
It makes sense.
And a lot of it was a response to crime, social unrest.
Okay, so they were there to protect everyone equally.
Well, not so fast. What's interesting is that even back then, a big part of their job was to enforce a social order. And that order, inherently, it disadvantaged marginalized communities.
Ah, so built-in inequality from the start.
It seems that way. And the article brings up this really uncomfortable truth. Early police, especially in the South, they were heavily influenced by, get this, slave patrols, their whole job, controlling enslaved populations.
Wow. I mean, that connection is pretty chilling. So are we saying that the very roots of policing in some parts of the country were based on oppressing Black people?
Yeah, it's a dark part of our history, and it still affects policing today. That focus on control, not on community safety. It really shaped how police operate, especially when it comes to Black communities.
And this pattern kept going, right?
Yeah.
Into the 20th century. I mean, the article talks about police enforcing segregation, even suppressing civil rights movements.
Exactly. And understanding this history helps us see why we still have these racial disparities in policing. The article throws out some statistics that are just, like, impossible to ignore.
Yeah, let's get into those numbers, because the article doesn't shy away from, like, the hard facts. For example, it cites data from the Bureau of Justice Statistics from 2021 showing that Black people are three times
Yeah.
more likely to have force used against them by police compared to white people.
Yeah, it's shocking. And it's not just about use of force. If we look at, like, killings by police, the Mapping Police Violence Project found that in 2020, Black people made up 28% of the victims, even though they're only 13% of the population.
Wow.
And in that same year, 22% of police-related fatalities were Hispanic people.
It's awful, and it really makes you think, right? These aren't just statistics. These are real lives. Families are impacted. Communities are hurting.
Absolutely. And the article connects this directly to that historical context we were talking about. It suggests that policing in the U.S. throughout its history has been a tool to control certain groups, disproportionately targeting communities of color.
It's a pattern that keeps repeating.
Yeah.
And it's not just about, like, these fatal encounters, right? The article even brings up the New York Civil Liberties Union's data on stop and frisk. And guess what? Black and Hispanic individuals are way more likely to be stopped and frisked.
Exactly. And when you see all this data together, it paints this picture of a systemic problem. It's not just a few bad cops. It's something deeper in how the whole system works.
Yeah, like there's something broken in the system itself. And this brings us to a really crucial part of this whole conversation. racial identity. Not just the people being policed, but the officers too.
Right. And the article really digs into how an officer's own racial background can affect how they interact with people.
So we're talking about the perceptions and biases, both of the officer and the community members. Everyone brings their own experiences to these interactions, which can be fraught with tension.
Yeah, for sure. We all have biases, whether we know it or not. They come from our life experiences.
Absolutely.
And those biases, they can impact an officer's decisions on the job, like how they see a situation, what actions they take. And then you have to think about how communities perceive officers, especially given their history with law enforcement.
So it's like a recipe for distrust, misunderstanding.
Absolutely. And it's not just individual biases, right? The article points out how things like police culture, their training, even policies that seem neutral, they can all perpetuate racial stereotypes, even if nobody's intending to.
It's almost like the system is set up to create these disparities.
And to see how all this plays out in real life, the article looks at some very specific case studies. Tragic examples of police misconduct where race was clearly a factor. And these cases, they sparked outrage, calls for reform.
Yeah, these are cases that really bring the human cost of this issue to light. The article talks about Eric Garner, Michael Brown, George Floyd. These names have become symbols of the fight against police brutality and systemic racism.
And each one, it highlights a different aspect of this problem. Excessive force, racial profiling, even other officers not stepping in when they see something wrong. What makes these cases so powerful is that they tap into the fears that a lot of Black and Hispanic communities feel every day when they deal with law enforcement. This isn't just a one-time thing, it's a pattern.
Yeah, and the fact that these cases keep happening, even with all the attention and demands for change, it just shows how deep this problem goes. It really makes you wonder, what will it take to break this cycle? How do we get to a point where policing is truly just and fair for everyone?
That's the million-dollar question, and it's what we're going to explore in the next part of this deep dive. We'll look at what role community relations play in holding police accountable, and we'll get into some of the laws and policies being proposed to try to fix this mess.
It's a lot to unpack, and I think we need to take a moment to process all of this before we jump into potential solutions.
And absolutely, it's heavy stuff, but it's crucial to understand the roots of the problem before we can figure out how to fix it.
Well said. So we'll be back soon to continue this important conversation. Don't go anywhere. So we've just spent some time really digging into the historical context of policing in America.
Yeah.
And it's pretty heavy stuff, right? I mean, we're talking about racial disparities, systemic issues, a lack of trust. It can be, like, disheartening to think about.
Yeah, definitely.
But we don't want to leave everyone feeling, like, helpless.
No, absolutely not.
So let's shift gears a little bit and talk about solutions,
Okay, yeah.
What can we actually do to address this really deeply rooted problem? Like, where do we even begin?
Well, the article we're looking at today, it really stresses the importance of community relations. Like, if we want better police accountability, the relationship between the police and the communities they serve, that's gotta be strong, especially in communities of color.
That makes sense, right? I mean, how can there be trust and accountability if there's this big divide between law enforcement and the people they're supposed to be protecting?
Exactly.
So are we talking about building bridges? Like, how do you even start to mend those relationships, especially considering all that historical baggage we just talked about?
Well, one of the key things is transparency. Police departments need to be way more open about how they do things, like their policies, procedures, everything.
So kind of like pulling back the curtain.
Yeah.
Letting the community see what's actually going on.
Yeah, exactly. Being transparent, it helps people understand. And that understanding can help build trust or rebuild it, I guess.
Right.
It's like, acknowledging that there have been problems and being willing to show people how you're trying to fix them.
Okay, but it can't just be the police explaining themselves, right?
Yes.
It's got to be a two-way street. The community needs to have a voice, too.
Oh, absolutely. The community needs to be involved in shaping how policing happens in their own neighborhoods. And that's where community-based policing comes in. These are initiatives that actually encourage officers to engage with residents proactively, not just show up when something bad has already happened.
So more of a partnership then.
Yeah, exactly. It's about building relationships, working together on safety issues, preventing crime before it happens.
Okay, I like that. It's a much more collaborative approach. But how do you actually make that happen? I mean, that's a huge cultural shift, both for the police and the communities.
It is a big shift, and it takes a lot of work. The article points to, like, partnerships with local organizations that are already trusted in the community, nonprofits, faith-based groups, that sort of thing.
Yeah, those groups are already doing amazing work on the ground.
Exactly. They've already built relationships.
So they could help facilitate dialogue, right?
Right.
Make sure the community's voice is actually heard.
Exactly. If we want real change, we need to listen to the people who are most affected by policing.
Makes sense. Okay, so we're talking about, like, changing the dynamics between the police and the community. But what about the culture within police departments themselves?
Right, right.
Like, how do we address those biases, those systemic issues that exist within those institutions?
That's a big one. And the article emphasizes the need for training, like really intensive training programs that focus on cultural competency and empathy.
Okay, what would that look like? What would that training actually involve?
Well, it goes way beyond like just knowing the law and how to use a weapon.
Yeah.
It's about understanding the history and social context of racial identity issues, helping officers develop the skills to approach situations with more sensitivity, with understanding, like recognizing that people's lived experiences shape how they view the world and how they interact with the police.
So it's almost like, humanizing both sides,
Yeah.
helping officers see the person behind the badge and helping community members see the person behind the uniform.
Exactly. It's about recognizing our shared humanity. But, we also have to remember that changing hearts and minds through training and community engagement, it's just one part of the puzzle.
Okay.
We also need to look at the laws, the policies that govern how law enforcement operates.
Right, so legislation and policies that can actually create systemic change. What were you talking about here?
Well, there's a lot of talk right now about comprehensive police reform bills. A lot of these bills, they propose things like independent review boards. So when there are allegations of misconduct, it's not just the police investigating themselves.
That makes sense. Having an outside perspective can definitely help build trust.
Exactly. And another big thing is mandatory body cameras for officers. So every interaction is recorded, provides transparency, could protect both the officer and the public.
Yeah, I can see how that could be beneficial for everyone, as long as the footage is accessible and the rules around using it are clear.
Exactly. It's got to be done right. And there's also a growing push for what they call duty to intervene policies. Basically, if an officer sees another officer doing something wrong, they have a duty to step in to stop it.
So it's about holding each other accountable, not just waiting for someone else to do it.
Exactly. It's about breaking that code of silence that sometimes protects bad cops.
Okay. And are there any specific legal changes being talked about to address those racial disparities we were discussing earlier, like with stop and frisk, for example?
Yeah, there are. Some people are pushing for laws against racial profiling and also for better data collection on things like traffic stops.
Okay.
So if there are racial disparities in how police are treating people, we can actually see it in the data and do something about it.
Data can be a powerful tool for change. So it sounds like there's a lot of movement happening, both from communities demanding change and from lawmakers trying to address these issues.
Yeah, there's definitely momentum, but the article makes a really important point. It's not enough to just have good laws and policies on paper. They have to be implemented effectively. And both the police and the community need to buy in.
That's a good point. You need everyone on board if you want real change. And I think that's where the power of activism comes in, right?
Absolutely.
The article talks about the role of groups like Black Lives Matter and all those local initiatives that are pushing for change, holding those in power accountable.
Yeah, those movements have done so much to bring this issue to the forefront. The protests, the educational campaigns, using social media to amplify the voices of those who've been impacted by police misconduct. It's really made a difference.
Yeah, they've put pressure on lawmakers to pass real reforms. They've demanded transparency from police departments. And they've sparked a national conversation about race and policing that I think was long overdue.
Exactly. It's like they've completely changed the dynamic between law enforcement and communities, especially communities of color.
It's inspiring to see how collective action can create real change.
Okay, so we've talked about better training, clearer policies, more community engagement. But what are some concrete strategies to actually move forward with reform, like beyond the laws and policies themselves?
Well, the article talks about a multi-pronged approach. We've already touched on some of it. Training, policy changes, but community engagement is a huge part of it too. Like, it's got to be a core element of any real reform effort.
So it's not just about changing the rules, it's about changing the relationship.
Right. It's about building trust, working together. So that means things like having advisory boards with community leaders, doing joint training sessions with police and residents, creating opportunities for people to voice their concerns about public safety.
I see. So instead of this us versus them mentality, it's more about shared responsibility, like everyone working together to create a safer community.
Exactly. It's a shift in mindset. But, even with all these efforts, it sometimes feels like we're just addressing the symptoms, not the root cause of the problem.
Yeah, that's true. And I think you're right.
I mean, we can't really solve the issue of racial injustice in policing without also addressing the broader societal issues, right?
Really?
Things like poverty, inequality, lack of access to education and opportunities, all those things disproportionately impact communities of color. And they create the conditions that lead to over-policing and distrust in the first place.
Exactly. Policing is just one piece of a much bigger puzzle. If we want a truly just and equitable society, we have to address those root causes. We have to work towards a world where everyone feels safe and respected and valued, regardless of their race or background.
So it's about transforming society itself, not just reforming police departments.
It's both, and they're totally interconnected. We need to envision a future where policing is part of a holistic approach to public safety, an approach that focuses on community well-being, addresses those underlying issues we were talking about, and makes sure everyone feels protected and respected by the people who are supposed to serve and protect them.
It's a powerful vision,
Yeah.
and it's really inspiring to see so many people working towards it. But I think it's important to bring this back to our listeners.
Yeah.
Like, what can they do? It can be overwhelming to think about tackling such huge problems. Where do we even begin?
It's a great point. It's easy to feel overwhelmed. But it's important to remember that every single voice matters. Every action, even if it seems small, can contribute to change.
Okay, so what are some concrete steps our listeners can take to get involved to make a difference in their own communities?
Well, a great first step is education. Learn about the specific issues in your community. Go to a city council meeting. Do some research on local organizations that are working on police reform. Talk to people about it, even if it's a tough conversation.
So it's about becoming informed, staying engaged, and then using your voice, right,
Yeah.
to advocate for change.
Exactly. Connect with your local officials, write to your representative, support those organizations doing the work on the ground, and remember, this isn't just about policing.
Yeah,
It's about building a more just and equitable society for everyone.
absolutely. It's about recognizing that everyone deserves to be treated with dignity and respect, regardless of their race or background. And it's about working towards a world where everyone feels safe, respected, and valued. It's been a really thought-provoking conversation so far, and I know we've covered a lot of ground.
Yeah.
We'll be back for the final part of our deep dive to kind of wrap things up and leave you with some final thoughts to chew on. So stay with us. Okay, so welcome back. We've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive, haven't we?
We have a lot to process.
Yeah, we've explored, the history, the statistics, and even talked about potential solutions, right?
Right? From community relations to laws to training. It's a complex issue.
It really is. But as we wrap up, there was this one idea from the article that I kept thinking about, and I wanted to share it.
Okay, yeah. What is it?
It's the idea that even though we've seen some progress, in terms of police reform and awareness of these issues, the fight for truly equitable policing, it's not over, not by a long shot.
Yeah, it's a long road.
Yeah.
And it needs all of us to keep pushing.
Right. It's going to take commitment from everyone involved, lawmakers, police departments, and I think most importantly, everyday citizens.
Because change, real change, starts with us, in our communities.
So I think that's the challenge, right? As we end this deep dive, how can each of us, the people listening, contribute to this conversation? How can we push for change where we live?
It's a good question, and it's easy to feel like, what can I do? This is so big.
Totally.
But every single person's voice matters. Like every action, even if it seems small, it adds up. You don't have to single-handedly solve systemic racism to make a difference.
So what are some practical steps? What can our listeners do to get involved?
Well, first of all, educate yourself.
Okay.
Learn about what's happening in your own community. Attend a city council meeting. Find out which organizations are working on police reform and support them. Even just having those sometimes awkward conversations with friends and family,
Yeah. Those conversations are important.
Because challenging those biases wherever you see them, that's part of it too.
Absolutely. So it's about getting informed, staying engaged, and using your voice to advocate for what's right.
Exactly. Contact your elected officials, write letters, support organizations doing good work on the ground. And remember, this isn't just about policing. It's about creating a society where everyone feels safe and valued.
Yeah, it's about justice, equality, and recognizing everyone's inherent dignity, no matter their race or background.
Exactly. Creating a world where everyone has the same opportunities, where they can live without fear of discrimination or violence.
That's a powerful vision.
It is. And we can get there, but it takes all of us working together.
So, to everyone listening, thank you for joining us on this deep dive. I know it was a lot to take in, but hopefully you're walking away with some valuable insights and maybe even a renewed sense of purpose.
Yeah, because the fight for justice isn't a sprint, it's a marathon, right?
It is. It takes constant effort, a commitment to keep pushing forward, even when it's hard.
So stay engaged, stay informed, and most importantly, don't lose hope.
We can make a difference.
We can.
And that's it for this episode of The Deep Dive.
See you next time.
Keep diving deep and keep pushing for change.